Okay, the quiz is done. It's time to, maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, but it's time to move on to propositional logic. We're going to talk about what today we're just going to do the basic building blocks, the logical operators for propositional logic. This is sometimes called modern logic or symbolic logic. We'll use symbols to represent the logical operators. But first, let's talk about the quiz and a couple other assignments or announcements. First of all, the assignments grading is proceeding slowly, painfully, carefully, we hope. In the AO section AO1, I've got 33 complete. Section AO5, I've got about 60 complete. We are gradually picking up speed on that. We will go back eventually and review some of the first ones that were done to make sure that we're consistent. And so that's that. And oh, there's the cat in behind. Well, you better say hello, Tiger. And also, we want to talk about concerns with the quiz. That and the concerns I heard were primarily that not enough time was given, that the inability to go back to previous questions was made it unnecessarily difficult, that the having the higher value questions at the end made it extremely difficult for people who didn't get all the way through, and a concern none of you had, but that I have, which was that I wasn't able to return feedback to you about your knowledge of the fallacies properly because we didn't get the grading executed. So those concerns are I take seriously. They're legitimate. A bit of a story. For about 20 years, whenever I've done the syllogistic logic in material in critical thinking, I've presented the students at the moment they hand in their paper with a choice. Do they want their paper graded or do they want it shredded? And when they say, well, what's with the shredding? I say, well, if you want another shot at it, show up at such and such a time and we can do that. And I think this is an important opportunity for students to, especially, I find it's especially useful in the very first term of university when people are gradually getting up to speed and they want to sort of acquaint themselves with what university is all about. And so it's not unusual for up to half the class, and you can see this pile here, roughly equal amounts at the end. And I think that's why I took the picture at the time. This has become known sort of within my circle of academic friends as shredfest, the rewrite festival, when my students, usually with a fair bit of pleasure, come in and put a bad test behind them and try it again. Now, I had announced that when I chose to delay the quiz, I thought, oh man, we're really going to get off track here. So I said then in my email to you, okay, there's no second chances here. We got to get this right the first time. And that was my thinking at the time, I'll be honest with you. And at the same time, so, what was announced was no Shredfest. Shredfest is one of the many festivals that's been canceled this year. Yet when I look at the quiz results, I'm thinking, never was there a better time for Shredfest than this year. Lots of the quizzes I looked at, and I would say not a whole lot different than pre-COVID, when it was not unusual. I remember one year, I think as an experiment, I announced about halfway through the class, and basically, 60 or 70 people just stood up and ripped their papers and walked out of the room. And I thought that was pretty awesome. These are people who know where they're at. And I don't think there's any shame in that. Looking at the quiz results this time around, I marked a few, but I looked at a whole bunch. And yeah, there's a lot that aren't done all the way through, lots that are pretty rough. Um, I'm a little perplexed by that because, it was an open book test. Someone who'd had their notes to hand should have been able to work their way through that. But I know that I suspect that one of the things that happened is people spent maybe even more time than usual. You have a list of fallacies in front of you. You could have soaked up a whole ton of time, maybe matching those informal fallacies to those texts. Um, I'm open to suggestion that it isn't always easier to have an open book. Another fact that we have to consider is that the grading for this first quiz is not going to start till next week. So, us kind of being, all this delay in grading means that we're still working on these speeches. So, my initial thinking that my announcement was like, that's it, may not be relevant because, the grading is delayed. So, Shredfest is back on, baby. And so, if you want another shot at the quiz, here's what you do. Basically, be ready to write next Monday, 1 week later. It's going to be the same format of quiz. Everything's going to be the same. New questions. This is totally optional. If you write the Shredfest quiz, then the original quiz you wrote yesterday, Monday, will be sort of virtually shredded. I say, Tiger, for crying out loud, stop clawing me. Just get over there. Okay. So your original quiz was just no one's looking at that. That will just burn into the digital death. Okay. It won't be virtually shredded. And why am I doing that? So, this has always been the Shredfest tradition, is that the self-evaluation. I mean, of course, you'd like to know how you did on the first quiz before you decide to write again. I don't have the grading resources ever, not before, not now, to make that happen. So you have to self-assess. You have to decide, did I know that stuff or not? And if you left, large portions of the quiz blank, you ran out of time, you didn't know what was going on, you had computer failures, you had poor internet. If any of those reasons caused you to perform poorly, great, let's do it again. And so this is a no judgment, no, nothing from me. I encourage you, if you want to rewrite, but I encourage you to think about why you want to, and then have a plan so that the same problems don't crop up again. If it was bad internet, can that be fixed? Or if your battery ran out of your computer, are you going to have it plugged in this time? Whatever. If you didn't know what you were doing, get that plugged in this time. So that's my thinking on this: is you should self-assess what didn't work for you, and then make a plan to overcome that. Okay, so no judgment. If you write that quiz, and what essentially immediately after we do the Shredfest, then I'll do a computer map, and anyone who wrote sort of the Shredfest version, their original quiz will be discarded. Okay, with that said, let's learn some logic. And this handsome fellow here is a guy named Chrysippos, who was, we don't know a whole lot about this, but we think this is the guy when it comes to ancient modern logic, if you can believe it. So it's propositional logic. That because remember we had categorical logic. That was logic of categories or sets, terms, subjects and predicates. Now we're doing the entire statements. So propositions and lots of names for this. We have modern logic, symbolic logic, and Boolean logic. And we have Chrysippos as the head of the Academy of Stoics. Tiger, you got to not be in the road there so people can read. And was the early logician mostly responsible for this. The Stoic philosophers, pretty cool bunch of guys. One of the most famous is a guy named Zeno who flourished. That's a double F, usually means kind of his dates are around then. So around 301 BC. And Zeno was a philosopher who was famous for paradoxes. One of them is what we call the paradox of the liar, often given as this statement is false. And then you ask yourself, is that true or is that false? Well, we don't really know. And Zeno, he wasn't just a stoner. He was trying to make important logical points about how logic worked. And so really, he thought that these logic puzzles were the key to unlocking how logic really worked. And if you're interested in that, there's other logic courses that you might consider taking. I think you need to get out of the way here. And the reason these guys are called the Stoics is because of essentially their address. Plato's academy was the first academy, and it was because his address was essentially Acada was grove or orchard, and that's kind of where they lived. The Greeks were pretty smart. They invented a lot of things, but they didn't invent street names or numbers. So everyone's address was kind of the description of their house. And so the Stoa Pokai is a painted porch. And so these guys lived in a house with a painted porch. And from thus, we get their name. The Stoics were a school of philosophy for about 800 years. And not just a school and sort of academic, but actually that painted porch place was a place where philosophy was taught for about 800 years until 529 AD, when the first Christian emperor Justinian, here he is here, looking, maybe not too dangerous, but he ordered schools of philosophy closed throughout the empire. And at that time, Plato's academy, Aristotle's school, that obviously succeeded long after their lives, all of that was closed down. And when they mean closed, they don't mean like COVID closed. They mean like really, burnt down, and maybe we'll lop off a few heads just to really make sure. So they're closed. And the upshot of this is, even though we know several hundred texts were written by logicians within this school, none of those books survive in their entirety. None of their original work survives. What we know about what these guys did in logic has been pieced together, kind of like imagine that I was trying to reinvent ancient studies of informal fallacies, and all I had to go on was the footnotes from your papers, right? So civilization collapses, perhaps as early as next month, and all that survives is the hard drive I have where I've saved your essays or your speeches. And we're going to now try to discover the logic of informal fallacies from your footnotes. I hope you guys did a good job, because civilization is depending on you. And so hopefully you've documented your sources well enough that we can guess at what those guys were saying by the documentation you provided. A lot of pressure for a footnote. These Stoic philosophers not only were good logicians, but they had a comprehensive worldview about ethics and the meaning of life and whether gods existed and so on. But the one thing that behooves explanation right now, we don't want to get into that too much, but the word Stoic itself, which remember just means porch, or I think, no, sorry, it means painted, right? Um, is because that word has become a word in English. And in English, it means, tough guy, unemotional, kind of the Spock, kind of, narrow perspective. Um, that has a origin in their philosophy. The philosophers of the Stoics were, their position was that reason rather than passion was the right attitude to have if you wanted to be wise and if you wanted to be happy. So for instance, one very famous Stoic named Epictetus, who was in a Roman era, about I think 200 AD. Freedom is secured not by fulfilling of one's desires, but by the removal of desire. And there's lots of other worldviews that have similar perspectives. These guys, I'm not even sure were the first, but are become synonymous in English by the use of the word stoic to describe someone who is not letting their passions guide their opinions. And as a critical thinker, those aren't not bad standards to aspire to. It's really hard. Um, Most of us, our passions get the better of us pretty regularly. Like when I threatened to quit last week unless they fixed the marking thing. Anyway, um, it was excellent use of an ad baculum fallacy. If you don't make the computers work, I said, I'm out of here. And faced with, that's a threat. That's an ad baculum fallacy. Worked like a charm. Okay. In modern English, we usually say someone's a Stoic if they have that dispassionate attitude, especially when times are tough, right? Just to keep a scorecard here, we're going to compare propositional logic to our categorical or predicate logic. So, we had predicate logic largely attributed to Aristotle. I think its most characteristic feature is that extremely harsh limitations on language use. That's on the quiz where I think most people struggled, right? Getting those ordinary language expressions crammed into a three-line syllogism where you have three terms occurring twice, right? Super limiting. So this predicate or categorical logic, extremely restrictive. There is only one logical operator, the logical operator of existence or of set membership, right? All cats are mammals. The logical operator is the R there. The proofs, pretty simple. Does it pass 6 rules? Can you do a diagram? Pretty simple. The Aristotelians didn't do a whole lot better than the Stoics with respect to getting along with the early Christians. So lots of burning and scorning going on. And this logic was rediscovered early in the medieval period. And, so that's the history. On the other side, Stoics allow much more variety in the expressions. So this is going to seem the language transitions going to be way less difficult. The cost of that is these arguments are going to have much more variety of structure and form. So we got some work to do there. The logical operators, if, then, and, or, and not. The proofs are less simple. The Christians didn't get along with these guys a whole lot better, so lots of scorning and burning. And then only rediscovered really pretty late in the 19th century. And that was, people searching ancient libraries, primarily in um, portions of the world that were, former, typically Eastern Roman Empire, super dry climates where things didn't decompose very quick, perhaps cities or palaces or cathedrals that have been continuously occupied, and so the maybe the scorning and burning had been a little bit less, and the history is that most of the places where these books, none of the originals survived, but you found a book that had a footnote that referred to another book that quoted, maybe a paragraph or two from a stoic logician of 1,000 years earlier. And by finding one quote and then another quote and then piecing it all together like a jigsaw puzzle, that's how we can put what we have together. The history is that, quite frankly, the places where these books were not burned were not Western Europe, but typically parts of the world the Muslim faith was practiced. And so us philosophers always get just a little bit testy when we hear the Donald Trumps of the world talking about Islam as if it's an ignorant way of living or something. Because quite frankly, the computer that's recording this right now has a logic that was invented once, and it wasn't Donald. Let's just say it's not the faith traditions of Western Europe that tried to save it. Enough said. So let's get into how it works. Enough of the politicizing, Professor Phil. Put the brakes on. Okay. The atomic propositions. These are the building blocks. These are these are the Lego bricks upon which we are going to build our empire of logic. And so now the word atomic is used exactly the way the physicists thought they were using it when they first used it for physics, which they thought smallest thing possible. Now, it turned out that the physics guys were wrong about that, right? You can break an atom up more. The logicians, we were right. Okay, so when we say an atomic proposition is the smallest possible, they're right. It is the smallest proposition possible. So a statement like "I am walking" cannot be. You can't remove any words from that without it no longer being a proposition. When you start adding "I'm walking" and "I'm texting," that expresses two different propositions. This is, "I'm walking" and "texting" is a pretty economical way of saying it, but it really expresses two propositions. One is "I'm walking," the second is "I'm texting." And so this we call a compound proposition made up of two or more atomic propositions. And when we're trying to find an atomic statement, we're looking for a statement that has no logical connectives, no logical operators. So if it's got an or, an if, or a then, a but, or a not, or any of those logic type words, not atomic. We're going to focus on the logic words, the propositional operators, the logic functions that are the most basic. There are many, many complex ones. We'll save that for another day, another course. We're going to focus on just those that are logically basic. So given these ones, all logical functions can be done. And so you don't need any more. It's sometimes convenient to have ones that express complex relationships, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to focus on and, or, if, then, not, and that's it. So the and is now there's fancy university words for these. So the and is conjunction or conjoining, putting together. The or, the fancy word is disjunction or separating. The if then is called the conditional, and the not is negation. Pretty obvious. We're going to continue to operate with this massive assumption that statements are either true or false. And I think it behooves us to talk a little bit about the convention that the notational system is going to use here. So when I say it's raining or tonight it's snowing, I don't say it's true that it is snowing. Merely by sort of having my positive demeanor and language, we assume that I'm asserting it is true. If we want to deny something, then we add the not. So notice that in the way English is used, and this is similar to the language of the ancients upon which this is based, the positive is implied, the negative is explicit. So if you mean no or not or never, then you say so. If you mean yes, then or it's true, you don't have to say anything. And the conventional system we're going to use essentially works the same way. So if we want to write that something is true, then we're just going to write it. And if we want to say it's false, then we're going to put a symbol in front of it. So let's go through this a bit more carefully. Any atomic statement, that's an entire proposition that has no logical operators inside of it, is typically represented by a single letter. And so if we wanted to say Phil is a philosophy prof, notice in categorical logic, we do a whole bunch of work. We'd be having all things that are Phil are things that are philosophy profs, and then we'd have to mark distributions and so on. We can put that behind us. Now we can represent that entire statement with a single letter. And so if we wanted to say it's true that Phil's a philosophy prof, we would just write P. And you should, when you see a single letter like that, you should say P is true. Right? Every time you see a single letter with no logical operators, that's being asserted as true. And if we wanted to say it's false, then we're going to say not P, or the symbol we're going to use is that little squiggle called the tilde, which is up on the top left part of your keyboard there. And you've always wondered what that's for. And, maybe you can make an emoticon or two out of it, but its real purpose is as a negation in logic. So let's put this to purpose. We want to see how we would notate or formalize ordinary language statements. So suppose you have the statement, there are 11 miners released from the Chilean mine. Well, that's kind of a dated reference. Well, there are no logical operators inside of there. There's no and, there's no if, there's no or, right? There's no no's. So it's just one single letter. And you try to pick one that maybe captures the most important word. But if you already used that, use a different one. If you ever heard the expression mind your P's and Q's, this is actually where that comes from, because P is typically, for random proposition, P, and then Q is just the next letter in the alphabet. So if you often have, when we're doing exercises, you'll see P, Q, R, S, and so on down the line. Just starting with, and so typically if you have a large letter P, you go, okay, we're doing propositional logic, I get this, that's what's going on there. In this case, 2 junior and 2 senior faculty were present at the appeal hearing. Okay, that and is doing a logical function now. It's telling you there's 2 propositions, and those 2 propositions are 2 junior faculty are present and 2 senior faculty were present. So notice the and gets taken out by the giving of 2 separate propositions. Either I will pass the course or drop out of the university. We could represent that as P for I will pass the course, D for I will drop out of the university. Hopefully that's not, well, yeah, hopefully it is true that you will pass the course or drop out of the university. Preferably pass the course. The primary tool we're going to use to do all this work is the truth table. And we're going to use a truth table to represent all possible values. It's kind of like a bit of a lookup chart, the way we had our circles and our square of opposition. We're essentially going to learn a series of tables for the logical operators and then learn to reapply those as a tool for assessment of arguments. So we're going to represent all the possible truth values for every combination of statements. So if you have a single statement, that can either be true or false. If every row represents one possible permutation, then for a single statement, there'd have to be 2 rows. If you have 2 statements, that doubles, right? Because one is true and one is false, and the other is true or false. But then you have both true and both false, and one true. So you end up with 4 in total. And every time you add another variable, you double again. So for 3 statements, you get 8 rows. For 4 statements, you get 16. For 5, you get 32, 64, 128. Sounds like all those numbers that we use to keep track of how much memory our phones have. There's a reason why those numbers are the right ones. But that doubling means that a truth table is a pretty inefficient method to use for real world arguments. We're primarily going to use the truth table to guide our thinking about arguments, and then once we start getting some intuition about them, we'll probably leave the truth tables behind. Since this is a very basic level course, we're just going to use those truth tables to kind of be the foundation upon which our thinking about complex arguments is based. We're going to use truth tables for 3 things, and I think this is where we'll leave off for this session today. We're going to define our operators. We are going to, and we'll pick that up in the next video, even though I promise I'm doing it today. We're going to analyze statements, and then we're going to analyze arguments. And so we'll learn in turn each of those slightly different uses for the same tool. And this is where, and I'll warn you about this now, there tends to be a certain amount of student confusion about these tables, not because they don't understand how the tables work, but because they're not quite sure which job they're trying to use the table for. We have one tool, and we're going to use it for everything. And so pay attention as we go forward. What job are we doing, and how does the tool, the table, get used for this job? And then when we move on to a different job, we'll use the same tool slightly differently. So having taught this material for a long time, honestly, that is the #1 source of confusion. So let's plant a flag in that and say, let's remember this list of 3 different purposes for these truth tables, and we'll be careful each time we're asked to use a truth table, what job is it we're being asked to do? The goal ultimately as critical thinkers is this last one. We want to identify invalid arguments. But before we do that, we got to do the others first, because we won't understand how the tool works if we haven't used it, first of all, to define our logical operators. that's what we'll do in the next video. We'll probably get these two tasks done in the next session, and arguments in a third. And we're moving right along here, folks. So to recap, Stoics, emotionally tough, or at least they did what they could to restrict their desires to what was achievable. Good logicians, and historians appreciate not every library being burnt, so keep that in mind. In terms of the quiz, next Monday, voluntarily if you want. Okay? And if you write that quiz, if you submit that quiz, I guess you can start and decide if you don't want to submit it. But the minute you submit that quiz, your original quiz is out the window, sight unseen. So you'll have to decide for yourself, and it'll be my job to try to design a new quiz, and I don't need any more work, but a new quiz as similar as possible to the quiz you wrote, which is you'll see is as similar as possible to all the other quizzes I've basically ever set up for this course. And I regularly go back and forth trying to compare not only design but also results. I think I can do that. Donald Trump is a bit of a curveball because his fallacies are so wonky that they're sometimes a little hard to assess. So Donald Trump aside, that's the plan. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.